former President Donald Trump wants you to know that he knows more about war than anybody, especially that dope General Milley. Take a look.
So I learned early on that he was a dope. I learned that when we walked to the church that was smoldering from the rioters. You know, that's what they were, anarchists that tried to burn it down, that they tried to say were wonderful, just, you know, protesters, friendly protesters. And Milley walked with me, and I walked with numerous people, but Milley, the next day I saw him apologizing. From the day he apologized, I essentially had nothing to do with him because they said, this guy's a dope. He said to me, because I said, we're getting out of Afghanistan, we have to do it, blah, blah, blah. I said, I want every nail, I want every screw, I want every bolt, I want every plane, I want every tank, but I want it down to the nail, screws, bolts. I want the tents. You know, those big, beautiful tents that house the planes. I never saw tents as great as that. They're like hangars. I said, I want all of them deconstructed. I want them. I want every single thing. And he said, sir, it's cheaper to leave it than it is to bring it. I said, wait a minute. Let me ask you a question, because I'm a construction guy, so I understand this stuff better than anybody. I said, let me ask you a question. You think if you have an airplane there, and you're going to leave the airplane instead of putting a tank of gas in, and the airplane might have cost $40 million, $50 million. We got really good stuff, or the Apache helicopters. I said, you mean some brand new, by the way, millions and millions of dollars. So you think it's cheaper to leave it where it is than have 200 pilots fly over and fly all the equipment out? Do you think it's cheaper? Yes, sir. It's cheaper to leave it than it is. I said, I got to tell you, I think you got to be nuts.
You got tents, big, beautiful tents. I love the big tents. They're almost like hangars. Well, actually, they're temporary. They are hangars. Oh, my God. I know more than anyone. You know, I understand this as a construction guy. I know all about the tents. No. Okay, so I love how he goes back to, well, I'm a construction guy. No, you're not. You're not a construction guy. Like, the only time you've ever worn a hard hat is for like a photo op, or when you're trying to pander to coal miners. Shut up. Okay, and here's the thing. He doesn't even build buildings. He's not out there with a hammer. No, and the only buildings, by the way, that he has built, very, very few of them. Most of the buildings with his name on it are just from licensing deals. That's how he gets most of his money. But when he actually did do that, again, it wasn't him out there with a hammer. He hired contractors, designers, etc., that did most, if not all, the work. And sometimes those contractors didn't get paid for it. He literally stiffed the contractors, for example, on the Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City. He owed them $70 million. Those were 253 different contractors who worked on that building. And guess what? He got away with not paying most of it. So please, the only thing Donald Trump really knows how to do as an expert is screwing over people who have worked for him. Honestly. But anyway, let's get to this assertion, right? Because there's an interesting new narrative coming out of the right wing about Afghanistan. All right. So and we saw it yesterday with Marjorie Taylor Greene and her gun giveaway video, and that's something that I missed the first time that I watched that. But now it's like, oh, they're saying we left $83 billion worth of weapons, tanks and guns and all that for the Taliban, right? So now the Taliban's armed with $83 billion in weapons, and they're going to use it against us, and that's what's going to happen, right? We just left all that equipment there for the terrorists. And that's what Trump talks about. Well, we should have taken everything, every screw, every nail, every tank, every plane. Some of them were new. Actually, no, that's not the truth. Turns out that when you break it down, for one, the number is not at all what the right wing is saying. That's false. I know, big surprise, right? So now, yes, $82 billion, I'm sorry, $82.9 billion was the total amount spent on the Afghan Security Forces Fund since 2001. That is an astronomical amount of money. Huge, right? That could have been used somewhere else. It could have been used for healthcare. It could have been used for education. It could have been used for food or building roads here in this country. But instead, we spent it on the Afghan military. Not a good place to spend that money. So yeah, that's that's one of those things where, look, we didn't have to spend it there. We shouldn't have spent it there. We shouldn't have gone to war in the first place in Afghanistan. A colossal waste of money. But let me give you a breakdown, right? Because what the right wing is saying is absolutely wrong. The majority of that spent wasn't actually on equipment. About $75 billion of that money was actually dispersed and used. And so what we're talking about for equipment costs actually was a total of $18 billion for equipment and transportation. This is according to the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction report. That is less than $1 billion a year in equipment, and that's still, of course, an enormous amount of money. That money includes, fuel, repair, parts, transportation, and of course, for all those things to get flown to Afghanistan in the first place. So that does add up. And there is a lot of wear and tear. Again, we were there for 20 wasted years. And think about it. If you had a car you've had for 20 years, and you rode it through the desert with people shooting at you, of course, it's going to break down. So, yes, if you've had a car for 20 years, even in normal circumstances, right, it's going to break down. And you're going to spend a lot of money to, of course, repair it or even, restore it. Or at the end of the day, it's probably just junk. And while it might run, it might not even be worth the effort to fix it, much less say you're moving, right? You're in New York, you want to move out to California, or you want to move down to Florida, whatever, right? You get this junky old car. You probably just sell it. You're not going to move it. It's not really going to be worth it. Especially if you can actually afford to buy a new one when you're living in Florida, when you go to the new place, right? And I know these are terrible analogies, but I think you can understand that. All right. So that said, generally for the military and the stuff that they left in Afghanistan, it wasn't worth shipping back. And that's the overall point. Okay. So now Anthony H. Kortzman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies did tell factcheck.org in a phone interview that most of the equipment provided the Afghans had been used in fighting over the last 20 years, and that most of it was still junk. War tends to use stuff up in a hurry, he said. So again, the stuff that we had there was old and kind of crappy and well worn and used, and the stuff that wasn't had already been moved out. This is according to Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby, who said the military had actually been relocating or destroying equipment in Afghanistan for several years. Because the plan, of course, was to get out of the country, and that's the right plan, since we were no longer serving in a combat role, more of a training role. General Kenneth McKenzie Jr., commander of U.S. Central Command, also gave some specifics. So now Donald Trump talked about the airplanes. So many airplanes! So many airplanes! 73 total aircraft at the ramp at Kabul airport, 70 MRAPs and 27 Humvees are just not operable. The planes that were sitting there in the big, beautiful hangars, the big, beautiful tents, were not able to fly. Either parts of them that made them workable were destroyed or demilitarized, that's basically what that means, disabled, or they were damaged beyond repair and it wasn't worth it. You can't go there with 200 pilots and a tank of gas and fly those out. They don't work anymore. That's why we left them. Dumb. Now, they also, again, when they demilitarized this, they used, in some cases, controlled explosions. Now, there have been reports of controlled explosions at the airport before and during the time that we were pulling out. That's what that was. We were demilitarizing old gear so that the Taliban couldn't use it. The military also claims they destroyed weapon systems like those that intercepted rockets and mortars. So, again, in reality, over the last few years, we had been removing that equipment and then destroying the stuff that wasn't worth taking. So now, that does not include the stuff the Afghan military was actually using, that when they surrendered to the Taliban was able to take over. Okay, so that is where they got a lot of their U.S.-made weapons. And so they are in possession of that. Now, what's more disturbing is that the Taliban was actually in possession as well as to documentation, biometric data that showed the Afghans which Afghans were helping U.S. forces. So that puts their lives in direct danger. So that's a big disaster. The equipment, not so much, and let me tell you why. Okay, so now, and by the way, let me just add too, there were some reports that Afghan pilots had fled the country in some jets and helicopters. So let me just add that, okay? So now, again, if you're worried that the Taliban is now going to take our weapons and turn them on us and attack us, it's actually very unlikely that that's going to happen. For one, we're not in Afghanistan anymore. Thank goodness. Look, all the Taliban wants to do is run their little fundamentalist hellhole without us messing it up. That's what they want to do. So they don't want us in there. They don't want us protecting women. They want to oppress women. They want to do all the things that they're doing in their nice little fundamentalist state, right? Okay. And so that's what's going on there. That sucks, but again, that's no excuse for us to actually be there. And again, they didn't want us there to begin with. They offered up our forces, they offered up Osama bin Laden to our forces 3 times, right? And so every time they did that, they said, no, we want to go to war. We would rather go to war with Afghanistan. That went through Bush, and then Obama, and then Trump. And that's what happened. 20 years of wasted money and lives. Complete and utter disaster. For nothing. So now that said, the equipment there, the thing about that is the equipment that they did get from the Afghan military is going to break down. It turns out that this is according to Lauren Thompson, a defense industry consultant, military analyst at Lexington Institute, quote, U.S. military equipment tends to require extensive support from technical specialists. In the absence of such specialists, much of it will run down due to wear and a lack of spare parts, which, of course, we're not going to be sending them. You're going to be sending them spare parts? What are you kidding me? No, you're not going to get any support from us. She said, vehicles also tend to wear out fairly quickly because of inadequate maintenance. And of course, she said this really applies in particular to aircraft, which will likely be grounded in short order. So the videos you see, you're not going to see Taliban driving around or flying around, I should say, in any of our military planes or helicopters for that much longer. All right, well, there you go. Vehicles also, for example, MRAPs, will be especially hard to keep operating because they consume copious amounts of fuel, will likely be in scarce supply, again, without suppliers. So, yeah, at some point, all the fancy shit that the Afghan military had is going to break down, and then the Taliban's going back to AK-47s and pickup trucks. All right, well, okay. Now, just a personal note here. The AK-47 is actually superior to the American M4. Why? It's easier to clean. It's easier. It doesn't jam, okay? Or at least jam as easily than the M4 does. It's better in areas filled with dust. It's almost indestructible. Likely cheaper to acquire as well and maintain. And so they're going to go back to that, mainly because it happens to work better. And of course, you can get cheap pickups and mounted guns and all that stuff. And so generally, they're not going to be using our equipment for that long anyway, because they don't have the support. Now, Thompson also added, in thinking about the price tag of equipment we left behind, it is worth remembering that much of it has been in the country for some time. Its value will have likely depreciated from the original purchase price. Some of the equipment brought home from Iraq, for example, could not be restored to a useful state and ended up being retired. So basically, all that is context into showing why this narrative that has been regurgitated by Donald Trump and much of the right wing is absolutely wrong. It's just there's just no factual basis in it when you look into the details of how things actually work. But it riles people up. And it scares people because, oh my God, we left the Taliban, we've got a bunch of terrorists now with our guns. Not really. Not really. So again, the thing is, and that's really sad and really needs to be focused on here, is how much money was wasted buying this equipment and using it in Afghanistan in the first place was. Billions of dollars went down the drain. Most of what we spent was actually paying the Afghan army and police forces. So getting back to that original $82.9 billion, of which only $75 billion was dispersed and used, 37 of it, $37 billion was actually used to just pay the salaries of Afghan army and police officers. That's it. The rest was for training and infrastructure. The $18 billion, of course, were for equipment. The training and infrastructure, which included ammunition, was around $20 billion. I'm sorry. The ammunition is actually included in the $37 billion. Sorry. The rest, training and infrastructure, as I said, was around $20 billion. So that's how the money breaks down. So again, that's a gigantic waste of money. What a waste. According to the Cost of War Project, based at the university's Wanston Institute for International Public Affairs, the war in Afghanistan cost the United States $2.3 trillion today, a price that includes U.S. operations in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Notably, that figure does not include the money the country will spend on lifetime care for veterans, nor does it encompass forthcoming interest payments for money borrowed to fund the war effort, because this is just one of George W. Bush's unfunded wars as a result of 9/11. So now, again, Republicans, they don't talk about the costs, though. Oh, no, they don't talk about the $2.3 trillion we actually spent on going to war with Afghanistan, a war that their party started. All right? But they do tell us how we can't afford health care or do something about climate change, but we're perfectly fine spending all that money on the defense contractors for nothing. Now, the only reason that they're complaining, and by the way, Democrats do it too. And let me just point out that Democrats also always tend to vote to increase the budget for the Pentagon. And of course, they also voted in favor of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The only Democrat that voted against that, the authorization for use of military force, was Representative Barbara Lee. She was right. Barbara Lee was 100% right. She knew what a boondoggle it was, and no one else did. So, you know, they both love the war, okay? So the both parties, okay? But again, Republicans now are complaining only because of politics. They know that most people oppose the war in Afghanistan. They know that most people are not going to do any research into this, whatever. And I don't actually blame them. But they are taking advantage of it. Because again, who's got time for that when you're working your ass off to feed your family? You know, sometimes working your uniquely two American jobs. All they see now from Fox News, which unfortunately is the most widely viewed channel in this country, is Biden left $83 billion for the Taliban. And that's it. And of course, they're going to play off of it. They're going to fearmonger it. They're going to try to use that to maybe fearmonger us into the next disastrous war. And of course, the only way to avoid this is to not get into any wars. Cut the Pentagon budget massively. At the very least, cut it in half, probably more, and use that money to rebuild our nation at home. I'm talking Green New Deal. I'm talking, human infrastructure. I'm talking Medicare for all. That's the stuff that we should be spending this money on instead of war. Now, if you support these things like the majority do, well, you can stop by not listening to lying right-wing politicians when they try to distract you with gross bullshit lies like this. The truth is, that money should not have been spent there. It should have been spent at home, improving material conditions in this country. But again, that is not what the right wing is saying. We did not hand over billions of dollars in weapons to the Taliban. They can use it against us. Most of it is junked, destroyed, or will fall apart with the next few years with no one to maintain it. And that is true. It is a huge waste to be sure. But once again, I'm going to remind you, that's exactly what war is. A gigantic, complete waste of money, life, and resources. Kind of like Donald Trump.
If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.